Hello, hello. Hi, everyone. Can you please get seated? We're going to start. I'd like to thank NetApp tonight for hosting us. And Oscar, I'll let you say a few words and introduce yourself.
Thank you. Good evening. Oh, good evening. There you go, much better. Hi guys, how are you doing? My name is Cesar Orozco. I'm with NetApp. I'm a systems engineering manager based here in Sunnyvale. And on behalf of NetApp, I want to welcome all of you, our guests tonight, to an awesome presentation by Sandy Pentland. NetApp is one of those companies that, since our beginning, we focus on innovation, right? We're always striving to do what's best for our customers and try to push the boundaries in the data center. And that's what we do every day, right? How can we help our customers get the most out of their data today and tomorrow? If you guys are interested in learning more about NetApp, there's a little table at the back of the room where you can drop in your name. Also, there's a chance to win a nice Apple gift card. So that's just a quick FYI. Also, if you guys are tweeting tonight, I'd really appreciate if you can use hashtag #HiveData. And also, if you want to throw in hashtag NetApp, that would be awesome. All right? Like most of you, I am fascinated, I'm intrigued, and I am very interested in big data. Big data technologies, emerging trends, and more importantly, right, how big data is impacting our society and how it's shaping our world. On that note, it's a pleasure to welcome and introduce Sandy Pentland, a top data scientist, thought leader in the world. So I want to thank him for being here with us tonight. I want to thank all of you guys for being here tonight, and also the Hive. You guys, thanks for organizing this event, coordinating this event, and putting this together for us. Really, really much appreciated. A little background about Sandy Pentland. Professor Pentland is a pioneer in organizational engineering, mobile infrastructure, information systems, and computational social science. That sounds like a big words, and he'll be able to explain what that means tonight. Thank you. Yeah, right. And Sandy chairs the World Economic Forum Data-Driven Development Council, and he is counseling many organizations, including Google and many others. Right. He's also an author. He wrote a couple of books. One of them published back in 2008. Honest Signals, How They Shape Our World. And most recently, at the beginning of 2014, he published another book called, Social Physics, sorry. And How Good Ideas Spread. This is just indicative of his thought leadership, his research, his body of work. And again, it's a pleasure to welcome him tonight. And please welcome him in joining Mr. Sandy Pentland to our event tonight at NetApp. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. Thanks, Oscar. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Thank you for NetApp for hosting us. My name is Pashu Christensen. I'm with The Hive. Who here knows about The Hive? Great. So I'm going to be very short. I'm going to say a few words about the Hive think tank. We host events every week. We are a community of practitioners, data scientists, designers, engineers, all focused on big data. We have over 6,000 members, which makes of the Hive one of the largest data-driven community in the world. We hosted over 60 events, over 150 speakers, and started about 18 months ago. These are our upcoming events. Next week, we have a partner event with DataKind, which is a non-profit organization. And then we have a panel discussion moderated by Svetlana, who is here from Gartner. Svetlana, I can see you. Yeah, here. And we'll have a lot of other events in November. So just stay tuned on Facebook, Twitter, Meetup. You'll see that I'm going to post the upcoming events. We'd like to thank our sponsor and NetApp. our new sponsor. Thank you so much, and thank you for having us tonight again. A few words about the Hive. Usually Ravi, TM Ravi, the founder of the Hive, presents the Hive, but I'm going to say a few words. The Hive is a early-stage data-driven startup incubator. We are a low-volume, high-touch studio, and we invest from 1.5 to 3 million in each one of our startups at the seed stage, startup that develop applications for businesses. So if you want to know a little bit more about it, I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. These are some of our startups, our office. And 2 more slides, very quick. DataKind, because of the topic of tonight, I thought it would be interesting to present. DataKind is a non-profit organization who helps non-profit organizations all around the world to use data for good, and they are recruiting data scientists to help non-profit organizations as volunteers. And Base Impact as well is here tonight. Sean, maybe do you want to say a few words? Thank you. And yeah.
Thank you very much for having us here. So Base Impact, we are a nonprofit that's backed by Y Combinator. What we do is we offer a full 12-month fellowship to data scientists interested in working with nonprofits and civic organizations. Just wanted to promote our hackathon that's upcoming in November. We're looking for the most talented data scientists, developers, and designers in Silicon Valley to come hack on data from our partners at the White House, at the Gates Foundation, and others to really create a lasting social impact outcome. We are going to turn the winning hack into a full-time project our fellows are going to work on for 6 months or more, and the winners will also get to have lunch with Jerry Yang, co-founder of Yahoo, and dinner at Joe Lonsdale's house. That's the co-founder of Palantir. If you're interested in applying or finding out some more information, the link is right there. Thanks again.
Great. That was perfect. Very quick. So yeah, those are 2 great organizations doing data, using big data for social impact. And with this, please continue the conversation online. We have a lot of hashtag, Hive Data, NetApp, social impact, what is the? Social physics, sorry. That's another hashtag you can use as well for tonight. And with this, Cynthia, maybe, do you want to say a few words? We have here Professor Alex Pentland, who was introduced to us by Cynthia, so maybe you can quickly introduce him again. And again, thank you so much. The stage is yours.
Now you're really going to come up in just a second. Hi, I'm Cynthia Phillips. I'm an economist, and I'm a big fan of the Hive, and I love working with the team here. I was really excited to stumble upon Social Physics, the book, not long ago, and we were fortunate enough to be able to invite Dr. Pentland here. And the reason I'm excited about this is I work with a lot of social enterprises, and I'm going to talk to you, especially right now, the Plastic Oceans Foundation, which we did an event with over at the aquarium not long ago. And so the work that Dr. Pentland does is key to helping us learn how to design effective campaigns for nudging behavioral change, like how do you get people to stop, polluting and reduce waste. So things like that are really important, and I think what he's done is just the tip of the iceberg to what we can do as data scientists to help improve the planet. So, and without further ado, let me really introduce Dr. Pentland, and he's going to come up and talk now. You got it?
Great, thank you. So happy to be here. I may have misjudged my audience a little bit. How many of you are data scientists? Okay. I thought this would be a very general audience. Instead, it's more technical. So I'm going to give a talk which covers a lot of things, but isn't going to go very deep and technical. You can ask me later. All the papers are online. There's a book back there that has explanations plus pointers to all the technical things and a bit of the math. But I'm not going to do any math, okay? Unless you harass me up here, which you can do. So I'm going to talk about social physics. And social physics is a term that's 2 centuries old. About 1800, there was a great deal of optimism about science because physics had just happened, and economics was beginning to happen, and chemistry was beginning to happen, and there was this thought that you could make government rational Can you imagine? I mean, it's like, I can't, right? Or management, really work. Can you imagine companies that really, no, you can't. And the dream was that you could somehow understand human behavior with a sort of mathematical rigor that you saw in physics. And they tried this for a while and they gave up because of two things. One is they didn't have the math, but the more important thing was they didn't have data. They didn't have, all they had is you could ask people, you could watch people and write it down, but there was no quantifiable, continuous data about human interaction. Well, today, we have big data. We have quantifiable data about interaction through things like cell phones and credit cards and highway passes and all sorts of things that we do day to day that leaves little breadcrumbs behind. And we have really interesting new math, most recently in what people call data science that came out of data learning. And I'm going to talk to you about some of the insights. But first of all, I'm going to give you a little bit of a sort of a quick and funny history. About 20 years ago, the notion of pervasive computing began. The idea that there would be computers, it was hard to imagine. Can you imagine a time when people didn't think that computers would be everywhere and the computers weren't networked? Well, 20 years ago, that's the way it was. And I thought that really what would happen is that the things wouldn't go into the walls, which is what people were talking about, but it would go onto the body. And so I created a race of cyborgs, which you see there. And that's me on the far left there, back when I didn't have white hair. And we experimented with what you could do with computation on the body. And some of these people, like the fellow in front, that's Thad Starter, he was a technical lead for Google Glass. So we were about 20 years ahead of our time. One of the first things we learned in doing this was that the average person would look at it and say, it's neat that this idea of having information all the time and all that, but I'm never going to wear anything like that. So I set up a collaboration with a design school in Paris and some of the world's top designers, and we began to design wearables. So this is a drawing from 1995. Now, you remember when cell phones were introduced? What's that guy got in the middle? He's got like an iPhone 6 or something there, right? And that thing off on the side looks a lot like Google Glass. So the designers really were sort of onto this, and the sponsors for this were people like Motorola and Samsung, who went on to produce these things. So that's sort of funny. So that's one thing we learned, is that people were likely going to carry around stuff like this, packed full of sensors. And that's, of course, what we have today. In the meantime, we discovered all sorts of interesting things, like you could do interesting art things. You could do dance pieces where your dress would respond to how you move. It would respond to how other people moved. So the thing on the right is a thing we did with Cal Arts, where the music is controlled by what you do as a group, not what you do individually. And it's sort of interesting concepts that we're just getting to today. Now we live in a world that has wearables everywhere, and I count cell phones as wearables, because cell phones are a little bit like watches, Watches used to be things on the walls, and then they got to be things in people's pockets that took two hands to take out, and that's where we are with cell phones. And then eventually, they moved to things on your wrist or other sorts of places where they were just ambient. And of course, that's what's beginning to happen now with cell phones too, is they're getting to be ambient devices. And so you see the Dick Tracy watches and the shoes and so forth. So the question is what are the other things that we learned? Well, these are sort of cool, they're practical in the sense of starting businesses, but the real thing that we learned is that we could now go back to what people called social science and begin to do it for real. How many of you took introductory psych in school? How many of you believe it? Yeah, okay. An awful lot of social science is basically freshmen in Psych 101 taking little quizzes. And it's really data poor. And it's not very sophisticated in terms of mathematics. And it doesn't really provide more than a heuristic for understanding people. But now what we can do is we can take people We can put little badges on them. That's something we do. We put little sensor packages on people, like for a month. Everybody in a company will wear a little thing instead of their name badge that knows where they are, what their body language is, what their tone of voice is, and we'll analyze that to understand how people talk to each other. Or we'll look at cell phones and other devices people have in an entire town, an entire little community for a year. And we'll take all of that data, and we do this under human subjects law. They all sign, disclosures. They all agree to it. They get paid. Don't give me grief about that, right? It's just like medical research. But we'll watch a community in depth for a year to understand how ideas are introduced into the community, how they spread, and how behavior changes. One of the first things that we discovered was that a lot of the sort of, I'll call it sort of crystal knowledge, right? Crystals and all that stuff, right? Yeah, is actually not so far off, but you can really quantify it. And the way to think about that is that humans were social species before we had language. We were groups. We, went out. We survived. We were fitness. We outcompeted other animals. And how did we do that without language? Well, we had signaling behavior, just the same as apes and other social species do. There were dominant signals and signals of attraction and signals that don't mess with me. And as we got language, what we discovered was those signals did not go away. We still have them. And you can build computers that read this older language, and you can do it reliably. Now, it's not like language in the sense that it has deep structure and things like that, but it is reliable in many other ways. So for instance, it's related to our biology. So for instance, how do you know when somebody's interested in something? Anybody have an idea? What? Pupils? What? Bending forwards. One of the primary things, those are all true. One of the primary things, though, is activity level. We have this autonomic nervous system. When you get, interested in something or scared about something, your behavior level, your nervous energy changes, and you become more active. So think about a 3-year-old that's either scared or interested. What do? They jump around and they won't shut up, right? Or think about a dog. What does a dog do when the dog is either scared or really excited? It wags its tail and jumps around. So we can read interest levels in things without words, and we can even read other species' interest level, and we can do this with people too. So for instance, in our lab, we had an experiment with semi-pro poker players. So these are people who had actually made a living off of poker. And we could beat them reliably enough to make money because we could tell when they had a good hand or when they were bluffing by having a computer vision thing look at their activity level, right? Because people aren't real good at controlling this signaling behavior. Or another thing is sort of empathy. People mimic each other. It's really fun to watch when you know it. If you get people sitting across from each other, and they have to be within about 6 foot of each other, and talking, you'll see one guy nod, and then the other person will nod, and then they'll both start nodding. They're like those little birds that, But it makes a big difference. So there was an experiment here at Stanford where they had a computer agent trying to sell something to students. And then in a second condition, they had a camera watching the student. And when the camera saw the student nod their head, the computer agent would nod its head, would mimic the student. So nobody detected this. And the one that was mimicking was 30% more effective at selling. Think about that, 30% more effective just by nodding its head whenever the human nodded their head. It's pretty amazing. So we have these sort of languages, and you can do various things. And this is the subject of my first book on signals. I'm not going to go much more into it except to talk about a couple spin-offs that we've done from it. So there's one called Cogito, works primarily with health insurers like Aetna and Humana. And what it does is when a nurse practitioner is talking to somebody with a health problem like congestive heart failure, it listens to the conversation and asks the question, is the patient engaged? Are they going to do what they say they're going to do? So the nurse may say, you should sign up for a health plan, for an exercise plan. And the guy says what? They always say yes, right? Oh, yeah, sure, I'll do that, yep. But 50% of them don't, okay? Which 50%? If you knew that, then you could do things to up the percentage. So that's what it listens for, is whether the person's engaged. Aetna tells us that this defers $20,000 in costs per month per seat. So that's a pretty good return for a little app that runs on the monitor of the nurse that's talking to the patient, right? Or one that you may be familiar with is Ginger.io. So this is a Valley firm now, started in Boston. And what we discovered was that when people are getting sick, their behavior changes. And it changes in a reliable way, no matter who you are. And so you can watch the signals that come off of the cell phone, and you can tell when someone's getting sick. Now, it's not perfect. It's only around 80% accurate. What good is that? Well, imagine you're a hospital, and you've got a couple 100,000 patients, and you know at any one day that a couple hundred of them are getting really sick. And if you could get those people in and look at them, you could get them better, because treating early is really good, right? But you don't know which ones. And they're not going to call you until they're really sick. But with this, if this is on their cell phone, it's like a check engine light. You know, oh, these guys, we're going to call those 200 people, and that's the set of people that we need to reach out to in order to be able to have proactive early treatment. And so Ginger.io is funded by Vinod Khosla, and it's done very well. So you may know about, I'm sure they're hiring. Shouldn't maybe do that, but anyway, so that's one of the things that we learned. This is another one. That's actually Anmol, who's the CEO. So as part of his graduate studies, we built a thing called the jerkometer. So what we perceived was if you could read people's signaling, then you could address some classic problems like husbands listening to their wives or people who just don't listen. And so what this did is it listened to you as you talk to people on the cell phone, and would give you a little jerkometer reading at the end, right? How many of you think you could use that? How many of you think you know somebody who should have it? Yeah, okay, that's a pretty good idea, yeah. A second thing that we learned is, I think, maybe more interesting, and this is about interactions between people. So what we've been able to do is look at interactions between people and build mathematical models that typically account for about 40% of the variance in performance. 40, maybe 50% of the variance. And that sounds, well, good as 40 or 50%. Well, what that means is you can identify high-performing groups with 80 or 90% accuracy and low-performing groups with 80 or 90% accuracy. And it's causal, so that if you see a low-performing group, you can give them feedback to turn them into a high-performing group. So, for instance, the thing that we did to sort of, that is maybe a poster child for this, is a paper that was in Science. And what we did is we looked at hundreds of groups of people that we dragged in off the street, and we had them solve lots and lots and lots of different problems. And what we discovered is about 50% of the variance between groups could be accounted for by the pattern of communication alone. So the performance of the group was not correlated with the IQ of the people in the group. It had a very weak correlation with personality. So your HR people probably always tell you about taking the, these personality tests. It doesn't really matter, right? It was correlated with emotional quotient, emotional intelligence. So some people are better at reading other people. And so if you had a group with a lot of people who were good at that, that group was had higher productivity. And it turns out that women are better than men at this. So if you had more women in the group, the group did better because they could read each other. But the interesting thing is that you could train people to do this. You could give them feedback about, are they having the correct pattern of communication? The correct pattern is very simple. Everybody engaged, everybody contributing about the same amount, short contributions, no long-winded anything, and acknowledging people. So when they say something, you go, uh-huh, really? Just like that, right? Nothing big. That pattern differentiated low-performing groups from high-performing groups. It's pretty amazing. And so the paper talks about collective intelligence and so forth. And what it shows, though, is that this pattern of behavior is a key thing that you can measure to be able to understand what's going on in a group. And the reason, the fundamental reason, has to do with social learning, learning from each other. And I'll explain more about that. So here's an example of some things that we've done that might be interesting. And this is also the work that now we have a couple spin-offs. I mentioned one here. So we took and we gave phones to everybody in a community. And we kept track of things like what apps they had and whether they bought data services and other sorts of decisions they made and how their social interactions predicted those sorts of decisions that they made. And what we found was that we could calculate many sorts of networks. So we could figure out who spent time with each other just from Wi-Fi access points. You know, did these people see the same access points at the same time? Did they call each other? Did they go to the same places but not necessarily at the same time? Did they share the same sort of, were they Facebook friends and things like that? And what we found is we could do, by looking at the first three, we could do a 5 times improvement over the normal commercial performance at predicting churn in subscription for phone companies. We could do a 5 times chance for predicting which app they would download. So that's a huge thing, because you know the biggest problem with apps is getting people to adopt it. If I know what the social influences are that give that, then I can begin guiding people towards apps. And in one country, we were able to actually increase the yield on data purchase plans by looking at this sort of network effects by a factor of 13 over their normal commercial practice. And what was interesting is the Facebook network didn't matter. It produced no statistical effects in these sorts of things. It was proximity and call first, and going to the same sorts of places second. Okay? Sort of interesting. So what it seems to be, what the story it's telling, just like the story with the small groups, is that it's face-to-face interactions with people or sharing the same experiences that's the most powerful way of having social influence between people. So you can use this in these ideas in many different ways. So this is an example of something that we did with little badges. We gave everybody in a German bank a little badge that kept track of who talked to who. Didn't listen to any of the words, right? Just did people talk. And most of what's shown there in red is the pattern of, actually everything that's shown as red is the face-to-face pattern of communication. So this is the advertising part of the bank. There's 5 departments here. So managers, development, sales, support, customer service. The red stuff is the face-to-face communication between the different groups. So when you see a big thick arc between 2 groups, that means the 2 groups talk to each other a lot. Most of this is not in meetings. Most of this is around the coffee pot, it's in the hall, it's not the normal sort of scheduled types of things. The blue stuff is all of the email. And there's a funny story about this, which I'll tell you. So as this ticks over, it's a whole month of data. So I'll show you the beginning of the month. They're setting an ad campaign. The managers send out lots of email. There's lots of meetings and conversation between groups. But nobody talks to customer service, right? And they'd release the product. It's a disaster because customer service can't support it. And then they have all-day meetings with customer service, right? It turned out that the reason was this customer service was down the hall and around the corner, had a separate coffee pot. And when they moved customer service into the same area, they stopped having this problem. pretty interesting. So it was the casual conversations that made it go. We've done a couple dozen corporations like this where we follow these sorts of patterns, and we find a couple patterns that are interesting. One is that within a work group, you get this pattern that's shown in red here, and I call that engagement within the work group. And the simple pattern of, if I talk to two people, what's the probability that they talk to each other? In other words, are the communications of face-to-face communications, are they loops or are they open graphs? That often accounts for 30 or 40% of the variance in productivity of the group. So 30 to 40%, as I said, is really big. Typically things like personality is 5%, training, IQ, things like that, 5%. So this is up to 6, 8 times bigger than the things that HR usually looks at. For creative groups, though, there's another pattern, which is, do they violate the rules in terms of an org chart? So all of you have an org chart, right? You're supposed to talk to these people and those people, but the org chart sort of implicitly says you're not supposed to talk to these other people. That would be wasting time, right? But when you look at creative groups like drug discovery units or things like that, it's the amount they talk to other people that they're not supposed to that predicts their creative output. So it's the extent to which they violate the org chart rules that they are able to carry out their job. And those two things together are the two patterns we see again and again and again. And it's in high-end creative groups like drug discovery, where everyone's a PhD biochemist. It's also in call centers. So for instance, we went into a call center. We discovered that the way they had structured coffee breaks didn't allow for any engagement among the workers. So they had no way to trade, tips about what do you do when the boss is angry, or, what about this new ad campaign. They had official meetings every morning, but not everybody could talk at the official meeting. It was a briefing by the boss. And I convinced them to change the coffee breaks so that everybody could talk to each other more. And immediately, the productivity went up. They saved $15 million a year on this one call center. And the churn went down, so the employee retention went up. And it cost them $0. And what we had done is we had changed the level of engagement between people, so people were able to trade ideas better. The same ideas apply in cities as a whole. So this is a company I co-founded back in 2006 called Sense Networks. Sense sold to AT&T's mobile advertising. These are people with cell phones moving around in San Francisco. The big dots are the most popular bars and restaurants and so forth. And you can cluster this to be able to pull out subpopulations that are essentially isolated from each other. And these subpopulations are highly engaged with each other. They don't necessarily know each other, but they see each other because they go to the same places. And so what you find is fads and decision-making tends to propagate very quickly within these groups, but not across the boundaries of these groups. So for instance, what you'll find is you'll find one group, the women like red dresses, another group, they like black dresses. You'll find in another group, they're not so good about this paying back the credit card stuff, right? Because their attitude about risk and things is different than the other people. And from a demographic point of view, from a normal sort of big data point of view, these groups are not very different at all. But they've learned habits and fads and practices from each other. And when you look at them through the eyes of the network that they're in this case the proximity network that they're in, you find that they have different behaviors. The one that's really important is that chronic health things vary by group also. So things that are diseases of behavior like diabetes or things like alcoholism go in these groups. So if you find that a group has a high prevalence of this, you suddenly know where to go to screen for it or to do an intervention. which is really pretty important. And we have a large trial that we're beginning at Mass General Hospital in Boston to capitalize on this sort of thing with a population that they have. And we're very hopeful that we'll be able to actually make an interesting dent in diabetes that way. The general rule for this stuff is interesting. People ask me, well, what about social media as opposed to face-to-face? And I have an example. It's in the book and was also a paper in Harvard Business Review that illustrates this notion of exploration and engagement in a way that's very different, but gives you a sense of what you need to be careful of when you're doing social media. So this is a social network called eToro. It's a financial network. So it's a little bit like Twitter or Facebook, sort of halfway in between. But on this network, you can also buy and sell stock. You can buy and sell currencies, things like that, gold, silver. And you can see what everybody else is doing. That's the thing that's really unusual. So if you're trading, right, I can look at what you're doing. I can see your return on investment. I can't see how much you invest, but I can see that you're really bullish on the euro and short on the dollar, and that you've done pretty well in the last 3 months. And I may say, you know, that's really good. She's making good decisions. I don't know quite what she's doing, but it's good. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 10% of my money and I'm going to follow you. And that means anything you do, I'm there with you. You're my finance advisor now, right? And I may like him too, and I'll put another 10% on him. And that's what people do in this social network. And the question arises, how much social following, how much social interaction is good for making good financial decisions? And it's cool because we can see their return on investment. So we know how good their decisions are. And what you're seeing here is an interesting thing. Along the bottom is how dense the engagement is. In other words, are you trading all by yourself? That would be all the way to your left. As you get more and more social, your return on investment soars up. This is all market normalized. Each dot there is the return on investment of about 1.5 million people for an entire day. So this is an enormous amount of data. As these people get more and more social, they make more and more money. The return on investment gets to be 30% better at one point than trading by yourself. So social definitely helps. But then it goes down. As there gets to be more and more social, things fall apart. And what I'm not showing is sometimes you get disasters. So everybody gets the same ideas following each other, and it's a bad decision and everybody goes broke, right? Makes a bad decision. So what is interesting is that if you look at the diversity of ideas in this social network, you find that the peak return on investment happens when there's the maximum diversity of ideas. So if what you're doing is following people that have very different strategies, then you do the best that you can, and you'll be about 30% better than other people. As the social network gets more and more dense, what ends up happening is new ideas get driven out. Everybody starts herding. They start thinking the same thing. You say, everybody's doing this, must be good. And that's sort of the first step towards death, basically. Okay. And that's something we see a lot in current social networks. You get to see these fads, these waves of opinion that wash over it. And it's driven by sort of over-social sharing. So that it's lots and lots of people seeming to do the same thing, but they're not actually independent of each other. So it doesn't count as lots of votes for a strategy or for an idea. It's just people repeating the same stuff. So you can use social networks to make better decisions, but you have to be really careful of these echo chambers. So one of the interesting things that we're thinking about doing is how do you build filters so that when I go on the web and start looking at something, I never see copies of things. I only see things that are true original opinions or examples of things that are from a community, and only one sample from each community. so I get the maximum diversity of ideas. There's a startup. You want to do it? We'll talk about it, okay? Let me show you some ideas about what that can do. So we had a paper in Nature recently, Nature Communications, where we got data from 300 cities using things like Foursquare, and there's a bunch of other ones like that, where we could measure this diversity of social interaction and the density of interaction. And what we found that we could do is we could take that measurement, and directly from that, we could predict the GDP of the city. And the R squared there is like 0.9, 0.82. The one on the left is the United States, 150 cities in the United States. The one on the right is 150 cities in Europe. So what that means is things like educational level, political stuff, like policy of the government, demographics, count very little in comparison to the flow of ideas and the social network density. So what cities are doing, they're not getting into this echo chamber area. They're sort of climbing up this area that we had here, where we're getting more and more social. And the more they climb up that, the more their GDP goes up. That's pretty interesting. Now, if you don't believe that, here's another one that's we're in the middle of working. So along the bottom are three things, which is essentially how many different communities do the social networks touch? So what's the diversity of ideas that are coming into the community? Okay? And we do this again using things like Foursquare to look at people who physically met up with different people from different communities. And as you get more and more diversity, the GDP goes up, nice and linear in a log-log scale. The number of patents goes up, same way. Number of people employed in startups goes up in a nice way. That's pretty good, right? What it's arguing is that the way new ideas come is by the collision of old ideas from different communities. It's not that there's some brainiac who comes up with a great idea and that takes over the world. It's that that brainiac is actually a fairly normal person, but they happen to be seeing ideas from this community and this other community, and when he put those or she put those ideas together, they came up with something new that really worked. So it's this harvesting from different communities and putting them together that seems to be the source of innovation. And that's a pretty interesting thing, as opposed to the talent theory that, you know, there are these special people that magic comes out of their fingertips or something. Here's another thing by a former student of mine, Nathan Eagle, and some other colleagues of mine. This is data from the UK, from Britain. And along the bottom is the diversity of social ties as measured by telephone networks. And along the vertical axis is the socioeconomic percentile, which they measure for neighborhood by neighborhood. They're called councils there. So they measure something which is a combination of infant mortality, crime rate, life expectancy, and GDP. And they mash it all together in a nice little linear combination. And it turns out that you can predict that with an R squared of 0.86 from the pattern of telephone calls. The more diverse the community is, the richer it is, the fewer babies die. That's pretty amazing. So just think about it. If I can look at the telephone calls, I can tell you how many babies die. And I can do it accurately, okay? And I can do it every week. Think about what that does to government. It's like, oh, Mr. Mayor, got a news flash. This neighborhood's not doing real well. You know, their baby's going to die there. Why don't we do something about it? Imagine that conversation, right? We did the same thing. This is with Orange in the Côte d'Ivoire, country in Africa that had a revolution a couple of years ago and isn't doing too well today either. And we used the same technique, in this case with cell phones and with mobility. it turns out that people explore more. They have more diverse interactions when they're feeling more wealthy. And you can use a measurement of the diversity of their interactions to measure how rich a community is. So we were able to plot the estimated poverty index throughout the entire country and check that it was a good estimate. Although we couldn't check in the northern part of the country because of the Civil War, and that if you go up there, you get shot. So it's not so good, right? But think about what that does for areas where there are no official statistics. And so this last month, the Secretary General of the United Nations put together a group, including myself, to try and do this sort of thing worldwide. You know, today, for most people in the world, for probably 4.5 billion people, you have no idea how many babies are dying, except maybe a decade later, maybe in particular spots. You don't know about genocide until after it's done. You don't know about all sorts of things that could be prevented if you knew about them now. And using these sorts of techniques, you can begin to get at that information pretty much in real time. And we live in the United States. In the United States, you know when things are going bad. We have good communication infrastructure. 2/3 of the population of the world don't have that luxury. You know, they'll hear about the epidemic after it already kills a good fraction of the people. They'll hear about the armed uprising and ethnic violence, you know, when some big thing happens, and I mean, you know, weeks later perhaps. And with big data, you can now begin doing something. So the Secretary General calls this the data revolution. So I hope you'll all become revolutionaries, right? It would be really interesting to have real-time transparency and accountability for everybody. Wouldn't that be interesting? Right? Let me show you another example of this sort of thing. So this is something we did in England, around London. So we got data from the police, and we got data from the tube, from the underground, and we got data from the phone company. So we could look at population movements within the London area. And when you could ask questions like, is this area undergoing a change in who goes to this area? In other words, just imagine a block, you know, like town square, and suddenly all the old people stop going. What would that tell you? It would tell you that something's going on, right? I mean, you don't know what's going on, but it turns out that if you see something like that, about 50% of the time you're going to get a spike in crime afterwards. Now, you don't know who's going to do the crime. You don't even know if it's going to happen. But when you see this change in the population diversity, in the mix of people, it means that there's social stress going on, there's change happening. And as I said, about 50% of the time, it results in higher crime rates, violent crime, things like that. So that's a pretty interesting thing, because this is predictive. This is a month ahead of time. It's time to actually get the social workers out there and maybe think about doing something about it, right? So, wearables, sensors, big data everywhere. What's next? One of the themes here has been that, perhaps unsurprisingly, diversity of interaction between different communities matters a lot. The mix matters in terms of crime. The diversity and volume of it happens in terms of innovation and startups and things like that. It matters in terms of GDP. It matters in lots of ways. And we live in a world where we have a lot of problems with this because people don't like to share data. How many of you have kids? Would you post your kid's location online? No. If you do, you should have your head examined. Right? That would be really stupid, okay? Or how many of you post your financial records online? Yeah, ha, 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 ha. But let me ask you another question. How many of you know what people like you, your sort of people, spend on transportation? Do other people spend more than you or less? You don't know, do you? Do other people like you make more money or less? Maybe you have some idea, but you really don't know. Do you spend more on childcare? How about vacations? Wouldn't those be interesting questions to ask and get the answers to? But you can't do that because there's no privacy on the web. Your data that's about you, data that you help generate, is not controlled by you. It's not safe to share because if you put it out there, it just goes away. And we're all sort of brainwashed that, oh, that's just the way it is. But it doesn't have to be that way. So when this sort of data started to become common, this sort of cell phone data, things like that, and I saw what was possible with it, I realized that there needed to be something that went along with the big data analytics, the visualization, and things like that. And that is, we needed to change the rules of the road so that people would be more in charge of data like them. And my thought was, you control your own body, right? You have rights in that. Why don't you have rights in your digital body, in your digital identity? Wouldn't that be something that would make it safer to share? Where, I could share with you, but tell you and enforce that you can't share with anybody else? Imagine I could do that. And so I started a group at Davos, World Economic Forum, where we were able to get the CEOs of most of the major companies, so Vodafone, Microsoft, Google, MasterCard, you name it, but also the chief regulators, so chairman of the Federal Trade Commission, Justice Commissioner of the EU, and so on and so forth, in a room together with people like me and electronic frontier people, things of that sort, and talk about, is there a solution for this? Is there a way to increase data sharing, the diversity of information? How can we make the web safer? And what we came up with was a new way to sort of think about data, which had the characteristic of changing the risk-reward ratio for sharing. And the key thing there is including the citizen or the customer in the loop of what is the data, what is the control over the data they have, auditing of where the data goes, and careful permissions. And I hope I have the right slides here. No, I don't. Sorry. So I'm going to tell you what it is. So the key thing is that regulatory change needs to give you vision of what data is being collected about you. And when you give data to a company, you need to think about that as licensing them for your data, right? So I will give you, Mr. Customer, Mr. Company, a license to use my data for X, Y, and Z. And I can retract that license, and I can audit that you do the right thing, like it says in the contract. So it's reverse of the way things are today. Today, you have the terms and conditions. You're giving them a license to do anything they want with it. This would be, no, I'm going to be in charge, and I'll tell you exactly what you can do for it, and you have to be accountable, Mr. Company. Okay? And interestingly, that's something that governments like, a lot of big companies are willing to go along with it, and privacy advocates like. You can actually build software that does this, but in this audience, it's really important to notice that there is no software solution that's only software. There also has to be a legal component. And so when I give you a license for data, that's a legal contract. Now, it all happens in the computer. The software generates the contract. But when you receive the data, you are also automatically signing a contract that says, you promise to do X, Y, and Z, and you are going to provide the means for automatic auditing of your behavior. Okay, people got that? It's a sort of interesting, sort of like turning the tables on the situation. And actually, it's not that bad from a company point of view, because what you're talking about is having a much deeper relationship with the customer. You're saying, Mr. Customer, our relationship, say your telco, generates this data about where you go and who you talk to. And we think you would like to use that data for X, Y, and Z, and would you like to, right? Or I'm going to give you an example I like. So this is Orange again. So they set up websites for many of their customers in Spain, and it said, Mr. Customer, here are the people that call you most often. It's not super private data, but it's private data. Would you like to assign them ringback tones so when they call you, they hear this particular jingle? And the jingles were things like McDonald's ads and things like that. And if you do that, we'll pay you €5 a month. And people loved it because they were getting €5 a month, and they were irritating their friends and the robocallers. People liked it. And, you know, maybe not for me, but you know, and the thing that's interesting is that generated more revenue for Orange, even paying the €5 a month, than advertising on television to the same population would. So it's an incredibly powerful advertising medium because you're calling your friend and hearing this jingle, right? But yet the person, the customers, made money off of it too and got control of it and could opt out anytime they wanted. So that's just one example. Here's something that we did. I did with FBK, which is an institute in Trento, Italy. It's an independent area of Italy. Telecom Italia and Telefonica. I should mention I'm on the board of Telefonica, advisory board. And we set up a scheme whereby people in this town control data about them. Not everybody. We've only had a certain number of people sign up for it. Young families mostly. And now we're going to do seniors next. And as I described, it's no longer the company owns the data. You have ownership rights in the data. And you can control where the data goes and who gets to see it, under what conditions. And you can, of course, do sort of quantified self-type stuff. That's not very interesting. But here's an interesting thing, is you can ask, how does my work-life balance compare to other people? Wouldn't that be an interesting thing to know? So you check the box, and what it does is it anonymously shares how much you spend time at work versus home with people like you in your neighborhood, right? Or how social am I relative to other people? I think that'd be really interesting to know. Or how active am I? You know, those are things that we care about. And it's safe to do that. Here's some other things. The young families are really gaga over this, like 95 to 98% adoption. Share the location of their children with other people. And it's not even completely anonymous. So if there are people that you call, you can actually see who's looking at it and why and when. But what it does is it solves a real big problem for families with young kids, which is, what am I going to do this weekend? I'm being driven mad by the kid, right? And so you can look online, you can say, oh, my good friend so-and-so is taking her kid to the museum. Why don't we go to the museum too? Okay? People love that. It solves a real problem. And it's safe because you can count on the fact that the only people that can see that are the people that you've checked off, right? So you know who's looked at it, you know who gets it. It doesn't go any further because you have this safeguard. Or one I mentioned before, you can share anonymous versions of your spending so you can see, do people like me spend this much on shoes, right? How about on cars? How about on, you know, what do they make? Do I make as much money as they do? People love this, right? Because now you can actually share these sort of intimate things, more intimate things, safely. And that's sort of the end here. Book back there, if you're interested in details, you can talk to me. A lot of it's on this website, some of the technical papers, not all of them. I'm a little broken with posting things, but you can find it all online. Okay? Thanks.
And we'll take a few questions. We have a microphone here. Make sure to come up to the microphone if you have questions, because this session is recorded. Thank you.
Dr. Pentland, excellent talk. Thank you very much. My question is, when you take ownership of your data that you're giving to a company. The problem you have is that you don't have control over what happens if things go wrong. Yes, you can get the audit data, but if things go wrong, you have no control over who got the data, what they did with it. Unlike the opposite way, where a company gives you license to a software or something, they can find ways to make that software stop working.
So
how do you deal with that?
So the difference here is we've set it up where when you give a license to the company for the data, you can audit what happened to it. Now, if they get hacked, the data can go off in bad ways. There are ways of dealing with that, actually, through watermarking and stuff like that, but it's not good if somebody gets hacked. On the other hand, when I give a company a license, in the license says, you'll reimburse me if the data gets stolen. So at least you can get something back. It's really just turning the tables. It's not a perfect solution. That's one of the troubles with a lot of this privacy stuff. People are looking for the perfect solution. Not going to happen. But what can happen is something where the preponderance of power moves to you rather than the company. And you have the ability to audit that things are correct and audit automatically rather than having to hire a lawyer. And that makes a huge change.
Okay, just a side question on that. So are you aware of actual production implementations of this capability?
Yeah. So there's a startup company, I should have mentioned it, called U.TC. There it is. But there's also an open source implementation called OpenPDS, and it's been adopted as a sort of proto-standard by the Kerberos Foundation, which is the basic security infrastructure for the internet. So they're taking on this idea as sort of the next generation of security for the internet, which I think is a great success. So, yeah.
Fascinating presentation. I was reminded of the example of Steve Jobs. I think he put a bathroom in the middle of the new offices so that people would have to go to the same spot of different types of different org chart. And the question, I think, is, I guess you didn't advise him on that. That was his own intuitive thing.
No,
but I'm interested in the idea of the physical physics of sort of interaction between people and, say, in a building or in a public space or in a city, and the sort of overlay of the social interactions. And if you thought about that, thinking about how people congregate in different spots and how that sort of interaction might be facilitated in public squares and so forth. And
well, we've thought about it, and that's sort of the focus of a lot of what we're doing now, is, you can take this basic finding that it's mixing between different communities that generates innovation. And then you say, well, how am I going to implement that?
Right.
And the approach we're taking to that is looking at lots of existing places and asking, where do you get the highest rates of interaction? Okay, is it the bathroom in the middle? Is it the coffee pot? We've done things like change lunch table length, so that people can't just sit with their friends, things like that. And what you hope to do is collect a series of things you can do to promote this, and then you can try it, right? The trouble with this is that trying it's sort of expensive, because you're talking about building a whole building or building a city or something like that. But it turns out there's a lot of cities being built, so there are people willing to try these things to see, how it works in the real world with these particular devices to promote those sorts of interaction.
So my question is regarding your work about the GDP versus the amount of social interaction.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering about your thoughts of how much of that is attributed to a causal relation, and how much of that is it's like whether or not they are forming a loop where one factor is supporting each other.
So it's hard to tell correlation from causation in these things, because if you could do the following experiment, it would be good. Like if you could go into the city and say kill half of the people, right? You could probably tell the two apart, but no one will give us the license to do that, and we don't really want to do it anyhow. But what we do know is the following, is that we've done it in small groups, and it's causal. We've done it in groups of like 100 people in small communities, and it's causal there, because we can do interventions there. And there, if you increase that sort of interaction, you get greater productivity, you get greater innovation by however they measure innovation. And so it's likely that the same thing happens at the city scale. The other thing is that, you know, there's a whole bunch of theory out there about how to build cities, how to build more innovative companies. All of it's based on zero evidence in terms of causality. It's just observations by sociologists or social commentators about, well, this seems to be something that I see in common in a lot of creative spots. And so we suffer from the same problem that they have, which is that we can't do real experiments at city scale. Yeah. But we have the advantage that we have quantitative data. Okay. So instead of Jane Jacobs saying, well, whole communities are better, we can actually go in and measure how they're better and how they're worse. And we can do it precisely across lots of different cities. So, you know, that's the way the science is working.
So data only show correlation, and the controlled experiment is the only way to show causality.
No, well, okay. So if you want to have a whole, there's a really interesting set of discussions. We just had a meeting at MIT about this with a lot of big debates. Most people will tell you that A/B testing is the only way to demonstrate causality. And I'll tell you that A/B testing almost always depends on very strong assumptions about the background theory. So a lot of A/B testing I don't believe, okay? Because it's based on, you really believe that? That's the only thing? How did you measure this other thing? So a lot of it I don't believe. Similarly, you know, there's the common complaint, which is true, that correlation, except in certain situations, does not imply causation. There are some places where it makes it awful probable. Like if every time I see A, then I see B immediately afterwards, then you have to tell a pretty complicated story to explain that as correlation. But the real thing is a Kolmogorov complexity argument, where you say, look, I'm going to look at this data from several different independent points of view, and if I see the same structure for all these independent things, then I become more and more likely to believe that it must be causal. And that's really the heart of the scientific method. So, and it gives rise to an interesting view, which is that science by itself is only suggestive. It's science plus engineering that proves things. Because I'll tell you, if you build something, you know, you're going to find people using it in ways that you never imagined. And if it still continues to work, you've got your hands on something that's real. Okay? So it's a complicated question. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I had a question about sort of managing the complexity of your data. If I start thinking about having, you know, we're all nodding our head, yeah, I can manage my data. It's like, well, the number of people I might have to manage with gets larger and turns into pain in the neck. And we're actually a pretty smart group here. There's some people can't manage their money, never mind data. So I'm just trying to understand how you think this approach would scale.
So the way the discussion, here's the idea about that, is that, yes, normal people have trouble managing their shoelaces, let alone their money or their data. And it's just the way it is. But what we've done is, for instance, in finance, we come up things like mutual funds. Do you know what your mutual fund actually does with your money? No. But you trust that they've been audited and checked and this, that, and the other thing, and they're going to do at least a halfway good job. Or you get recommendations from people you trust about these guys are able to manage it well, you should try them. And the same thing will happen with data. There'll be, you know, ways to manage your data that are recommended by AARP, by your employer, by your church group, and over time they'll evolve and be pretty good. But I can't manage my data. It's complicated, right? You need to have experts studying it. You need to look at all the bad things that happen and figure out the best policy. It's going to be like managing money. But, you know, what's the alternative? No data? If there's no data, then you don't know where the kids are dying, right? That's bad. That's worse, right? So we're going to have data. We're going to have an efficient society that can address, you know, global warming and things like that. And we're going to have to put up with the complexity the same way we do with financial things, by having advisors and auditing structures and things like that.
What about a related thing is in terms of being able to identify quote-unquote anonymized data? For example, just simple patterns.
The idea of anonymized data is BS, right? It's just like every time it happens, you can re-identify it, okay? Now, that doesn't mean it's not useful. For instance, when I share data with people, I make them sign a legal agreement first. And the agreement says, you will use it for these purposes, and if you try to re-identify it, you have to give me your firstborn and all of your money, okay? Right? And I can watermark it so I know if you do it. Yeah, okay? And that's getting to be the standard, is that there are no technical means that I've seen for really doing anonymization on a person-by-person basis, because there's always another set of data that can be brought in. But I can bind you by legal restrictions to doing what you promised to do, and I can audit you. And that's what we do with money. If I give you money and say you have to invest it this way, you could take it and go to Mexico, right? But people don't do that because we have enough auditing and other things in place that it's just not practical to do. So you need both parts of it. I mean, fortunately or unfortunately, right?
I work with NGOs to help them with movement building strategy, and so I was particularly interested in your work in social fMRI and the interventional work. And I was wondering if you could talk about that and how lay people could implement it.
Well, the fMRI is basically a term for dense data about behavior in a community. And the term actually came up when we were doing a small living community of young families. So we knew their Facebook, their financial data, everything you could get off of a phone, sort of their government type data, things like that. And that was done under human subjects law, which means that we're bound by federal law to hold the data in a secure way, and only people can look at it, have to be qualified under the federal regulations and blah, 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 okay? And that's good for research, because now you have all the variables, or as many variables as you can imagine, for trying to understand what's going on. So for instance, we're doing the same thing with Mass General Hospital to get a better understanding of diabetes. So diabetes is likely actually 5 separate diseases. Nobody knows because they haven't had rich enough data about behavior and phenotypic variables to be able to tease the different types of diabetes apart. And as a consequence, treatments for diabetes are catch as catch can. They'll work on 20% of the population, but they don't know which 20%. And so doing this sort of experimentation, this dense experimentation, is a really interesting way to get into the causality problem and at the basic structure of the phenomenon you're observing. So from a scientific point of view, it's sort of, I think it's going to be the new gold standard, right? As opposed to the sort of sparse A/B testing, where that's mostly driven by money. You say, well, I can't test all these variables, so I'm going to take the 2 best ones I like, and I'm going to try one, and no, we want to find out all the things we can so that we have the covariates and the consequences, right? So does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about an analogy. You know how we say financial banks, some of them are too big to fail. Do you think we're in a phase where we're building these data banks with certain corporations that are collecting a lot of information about a lot of people? For example, Facebook, Google, Apple, the telecoms, because they know a lot more about you than your family does sometimes. Do you think there's going to be negative consequences in the future where these data banks or these corporations have too much information about you that, could have negative consequences, or,
Well, there's 2 things. Right? One is that that's why this sort of approach to privacy, that you know what data there is about you and have control over it, is so important. is because you want to avoid that future. And there's really only one person who can make those judgments, and that's you, okay, about what's too much and what's inappropriate. So government can make laws that say you can only retain data for a short period of time. It has to be data that's relevant to the service being provided. And those laws are on the books already, right? And they're tightening the screws on those things. It's far from perfect, but the screws are tightening, okay? But in the end, the question of how much data there is, where it is, things like that, has to be put back in the individual's hands in some sense. Right? Maybe it's like a mutual fund where you don't do it, but you have an agent that does it. There's another issue, and the other issue is there's too much data in one place. So when the NSA had, the Snowden event, I thought it was really interesting because the head of the NSA said, we made 2 mistakes. So the small mistake was giving Snowden permission out of everything. You might have thought that was the big mistake, right? No, he said the big mistake was putting all that data in one place. Because when you put all the data in one place, the bad guys know exactly where to go. So Snowden did all this stuff. How many people do you think did the same thing as Snowden but didn't tell us about it? 10? 8? I guarantee you it's more than 0, right? And of course, Germany does the same thing, and UK does the same, we need to have a different way of handling this big personal data. I have a Scientific American article last month, I think, that argues that you need to think about data like this as being completely distributed, and that authorities that certify it are also distributed, so that there's no one, too big to fail type thing, including the government. The government should not have control over all of your data, just period, right? Google shouldn't, Facebook, nobody, the banks shouldn't, et cetera. It should be distributed so that somebody can attack and get some of the data, but they can't get all of the data ever, right? And so we need to think about this as sort of this war that's going on, where we're going to lose some of the battles, but we don't want to lose the whole thing. And the only way to do that is you have to have both the software and data distributed and heterogeneous, but the people also heterogeneous. The way you do a spy ring or something like that, where there's no one person who's in control of everything. Yeah. The internet. A little bit like the internet or Bitcoin, the ledger in Bitcoin. Yeah.
Makes sense. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see the next 20, 50 years.
This is the crowd to do it, right? So you guys, get on it, right?
Hey, I deal with a lot of data science related to the telco infrastructure, mobile networks and stuff. I noticed you also used, in at least a few studies, your primary source as some of the mobile networks and stuff. Mm-hmm. Now, in that domain, one of the things that telcos continuously worry about is churn. These subscribers that I have, next month, what is the probability this specific guy is going to churn out, or that guy is going to churn out, and so on and so forth. And one of the things, as I was looking at your study on cohorts, social cohorts doing similar things, etc., was just as part of that or whatever, whether you had come across the question whether churn is a social behavior or not. Because there's a lot of study on churn on an individual basis. I'm not getting good data connection, maybe next month I churn out. Or my bill is too high, maybe next month I churn out. But could it also be that, okay, if I see everybody else leaving Verizon,
Verizon? Churn is very definitely a social phenomenon. So social networks, when one or two people in a tight network leave a service, the likelihood of everybody else leaving becomes extremely high. But what's interesting is people have done the analysis wrong. They've used the wrong sort of social relationships in doing that analysis. And so that's why we're able to get such better performance than they do. Okay? Yeah.
In my field, which is back pain, the best data comes from Scandinavia, like Sweden in particular. And it's because they tend not to move around, so you can follow people for 10 years and they stay put.
Yeah.
And it's a very homogeneous population. So that, and I've also always thought of the Scandinavians as having a particularly high standard of living and so on. So I'd like your help in consolidating those two pieces of data.
Well, so what tends to happen, what sort of, taking the things that we found in the data and sort of applying it to the real world, what you find is if you have a sort of a static situation, small village, for instance, that you get a great deal of social support there, but it's a very static type of situation. So it's not a very innovative thing. Now that's actually great for raising kids and stuff, but it's not so good for GDP. If you have combined that with some of the people from the village working in the big city, so you get a lot of diversity at these little communities in the big city, then in the big city you get this sort of diverse social networks that are good for innovation. Another example of this is Zurich, which decided to put in a transportation structure where people would live in these little Swiss villages, which are very static and in some sense not very retrograde, they're not innovative at all, but that everybody comes to the central city every day. And so you get a great deal of diversity in the central city because of their transportation network. So that's interesting because in the village then, what you get is you get something that's a low crime environment. You get a very predictable environment where everybody knows each other. There's very clear norms of behavior, which is good for raising kids, for instance, or for supporting elders or people that are sick, okay? But at the same time, you get this highly diverse area in the city where a lot of stuff can happen. So there are ways of engineering these things such that you get pretty much the best of both worlds. Not completely, but a lot of it. And I think Scandinavia is a lot like that, actually. Yeah.
So I work in the K through 12 education space, and so I'm really interested in your observations about data living in different systems, because often in K through 12 education, we're collecting a lot more data in different data systems, and in order for students to improve or for a teacher or a coach to help a student, they really need to look at these data in an integrated way. So what's the solution?
So the educational system and the laws around that are designed to prevent high performances, apparently, right? Because everything's siloed and you have to have immediate permissions. You can't have permanent permissions. It's just a mess. And the health system is not much better than that. HIPAA protects privacy, but it also means that you have, poor performance at best. So the thing that I'm suggesting is that data is distributed like that, but that you have the ability to give permissions, sort of like living wills or living permissions, that allow them to be dynamically combined so that they look like they're all in the same space. And also the ability to turn off the permissions when you want, or to specify that they expire. So it's a dynamic version of these systems, whereas the law that they're written for is very static. They say, here it is for all time.
Right, and I'm thinking of the implosion that happened with the system In Bloom, the company In Bloom that tried to build these kind of massive data systems, and parents didn't want their kids' data to be stored in these, primary data system.
Well, people want to have careful control of where the data goes and who can look at it, okay? So it's not like, trust me, I'll do good stuff, and I put it all in one spot and I can do anything with it now. Yeah. That's really sort of the NSA story, is they stuck it all in one spot and people could do anything with it, right? And so you need the very fine-grained, dynamic permissioning and auditing, because they're going to screw up, right? You want to catch it. You want to be able to say who did what to it. And that sort of stuff would be a nightmare 20, 30 years ago, but we can do it now. And in fact, the proof of it is that there are some companies that do that internally, like AT&T, just so that they don't violate state laws. They collect data in one state, and they know where it was collected and who gave the permissions, and whenever they use it, they check that that permission is legal in this context. So they carry along the permissions and context with all the data. That way they never get into trouble. That's the theory.
Yes, hi. So I'm a founder of a small company, and I have a question of how do you balance this trust between the user and exposing what you actually do? Because once you start telling people what you're trying to do with their data, you're losing all the competitive advantage. So there has to be some...
Well, no, I don't believe that. What you're doing is you're building a customer relationship, right, by involving them and giving them value back for what you're doing so that they'll be loyal to you. That's a way to think about that. And the second thing is if you're talking about technical details, you know, people don't want to hear that. You know, people give data to supermarkets, they give data to Google. They don't know what goes on inside. They don't care what goes on inside. What they want to know is, you know, is my data going anywhere else ever? The answer had better be no, or only if you give us explicit permission for particular things. Those are the only two allowable answers, period. And the second thing is, how are you making money off of this? And how much am I going to share in it? Okay, and if you don't have a good answer for that one, then you're screwed. Sorry.
Yeah, so basically, I mean, that's how Facebook built their model, right? Like they were telling that they give certain things to the user, but in the background, they were building this business model that
And that's
came
why
out
they
later,
get
right?
so much grief over privacy, right? Because they're not following those rules. Okay, and people didn't pay attention to it for a long time, but increasingly people are paying attention to it, and increasingly the regulators are paying attention. The way regulation works in this country, incidentally, right? So if you talk to them, they're going to start, they have this idea about privacy by design and informed consent, okay? That's what I'm talking about. Who are they going to start with? Well, you know, there's all these companies out there making a lot of money, employing a lot of people that are not behaving correctly. But there are some companies that want to get into the business and can't, like banks, telcos, hospitals, because they're heavily regulated and they don't have permission. And so what the government is saying is, you can get into the data business if you follow these very high bar rules. You tell people what you're doing, you show them the data, you involve them in the value proposition. And when that works, when these regulated industries figure out how to do it, then they're going to go to these other companies and say, you know, the banks do it, the hospitals do it, you have to do it too. And guess what? They're going to have to change. And they're already doing this with the more gregarious examples. So there's been lots of little press by the Federal Trade Commission saying that they're going to go out and kill all the gray companies that are basically data siphons and resellers. And they're working slowly towards doing that. So I wouldn't want to be in that business. You do okay for a little while, but in the long run, you're not going to do okay. And what I'll probably do, somebody will do is, if you're in that business, someone will do the same sort of thing, maybe not as well, but they'll be respectful of the customers and involve the customers, and they'll just kill you, right? Because why would somebody go with that company rather than the one that involves the customers and is transparent? This is a stupid thing to do. They're not going to do it. Okay?
Thank you.
We're going to have to finish this because I'm going to fall asleep.
All right. Maybe I can take last one. Yeah. So Sandy, great ideas. My key takeaway was proximity matters within the groups. Yeah. Right. So, but that is the world as we know it, right? So even here, you know, we are all interested in data, but there is nobody here interested in, let's say, selling mortgages or something, right? So proximity matters within the group, but how do you then spread ideas across groups, or have you found through your studies anything different which will change?
Well, yeah, so look, the Valley is a poster child for this. I was talking to somebody who said, oh yeah, we've been at several companies together. People hop companies here all the time. How do you think ideas spread? You work next to the guy who knows how to do X and has heard about Y.
But they're still within the group. Like, so that would be, let's say, group of networking, or the cross grouping
it's not that tight. It really isn't. Plus, you know, in a startup, you do all sorts of different jobs. There's no group, right? Sure. And so you have enough people who cut across boundaries here that ideas spread very, very quickly. Sure. As opposed to, say, for instance, traditional Boston, where you know, when you leave a job, you can't work in the same area anymore, right? Because they have non-compete, unlike California. Okay, so you know the fact that you learned all these ideas doesn't count, right? Because you no longer work in the area. So there's lots of systematic things here that help the Valley be a vibrant sort of a place that are disadvantages in other places. In an existing company, there's lots of things you can do. Co-working is a great idea where you have lots of local work spots. So, you know, wherever you live, there's someplace of your company nearby where you go there and you find people from 5 other divisions there also. So you get to hear what the sales guys are doing and the execs are doing, and they get to hear what your problems are. That's huge in terms of propagating ideas within a corporation. Okay?
Sure, thank you.
Yeah.
Right, thank you.
There's still some books back there.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time and your presentation, Professor Pentland. And Kepler's book came all the way here with some books, so make sure to take one on your way out. And yeah, see you again soon. Thank you so much.